Hi biology students, I'm going to debrief the evidence for evolution document. Model 1 was pretty easy. It's a pedigree chart. This is a review for you. Question 1 says, how are the organisms in the third line, right here, related to the organisms in the first line? These are the grandchildren of these parents, person 1 and 2. This should say, consider line 2, right here, and describe one trait from members 3, 5, and 7 that were not there before, meaning that their parents did not have. There's lots of examples of that. In person 3, they have a black moon-shaped mouth and then what we might call an L-shaped base right here, which is not present in either of the parents. In person 5, they have square eyes, triangular ears, which that combination was not there before. We do have triangular ears over here, but we don't have it with square eyes. In person 7, they have black rectangular hair, which neither person 1 or 2 has. They have a triangle on their forehead. They have triangle ears, and they have what's called a trapezoid base. Consider the third generation. How many of the organisms in this generation exhibit one or more traits identical to one of the grandparents? All of them exhibit at least one trait identical to a grandparent. So this person right here has the circular eyes. Person 10 also has the circular eyes. Person 11 has triangular ears. So you can find at least one trait in each grandchild that matches at least one grandparent. How did these traits get passed on? Through the generations from parent to offspring, through the DNA. That's the big idea here. The DNA of the parents was duplicated and used to make eggs and sperm, which were used to create the children and grandchildren. Consider the third generation again. How many of the organisms in this generation exhibit one or more traits that are not shown in one of the grandparents? All of them exhibit at least one trait that is different from the grandparents. So this base is different in person 10 than either grandparent. This, see what we have over here. The square eyes in person 11 is different than either grandparent. This type of hair is different than either grandparent. So you can find at least one example in each of the grandchildren. Describe two methods by which these traits might have been introduced into the family. Mutation is one possibility, mutation in the DNA, or the trait could have come from the DNA of an organism that married into the family. In Model 1, which line of offspring shares the most traits with the parent organisms in the first line? The children or the grandchildren? The children do. The three children, which are here, they're person 4, 6, and 8. The three children all have either the mouth shape of the mom or the dad, or there are some other examples you could find. Which line of offspring shares the most DNA with the parent organisms in the first line? The children or the grandchildren? The answer is the children share the most DNA with their parents. Where did the original parent organisms in the first line in Model 1 get their traits? From their parents or grandparents or other ancestors. Okay, now we're on to Model 2. Model 2 shows a classic diagram, which you should become very familiar with, several what we call homologous structures. These are limbs or body parts that are similar in structure because of shared ancestry, even though they are not necessarily similar in function. So list two or more similarities in the bone structure of the four animals shown. They basically all have the same design of their forelimb. They have one bone called a humerus, which is connected to two smaller bones called a radius and ulna, which is connected to a set of wrist bones called carpals and a set of finger bones called metacarpals and phalanges. And these bones are connected in the same order in each of these limbs, even though they have a different function. List one major way the structures of the bones of the 4 animals shown differs. Lots of ways to answer that question. The length of the similar bones is different in each organism. The number of carpals and the general shape of the bones and or the joints are slightly different in each organism. How might larger size provide an advantage to an organism in a population, and how might this impact a population over time? This could be explained if you remember VIST, which we learned at the beginning of the year: variation, inheritance, selection, and time. So the natural genetic variation would be the size. The selection would be the environment that, for whatever reason, was selecting large size over small size for better survival. Maybe large size is able to get more food, and therefore organisms who are larger survive in greater numbers than those who are smaller. That's just one of many possible explanations. The genes for large size are passed on to the offspring, and over time, the population would evolve, and we would see more large-sized organisms in that population. What do the similarities among 4-limb bone arrangement of these diverse animals mean about their ancestry? It means that they may share a common ancestor. It is one type of evidence for common ancestry. Which 2 animals in Model 2 would you predict have the most DNA sequences in common? There's more than one possible answer to this. The dog and the whale have the same number of bones in each category, so we could infer that they would share the most DNA. But you could also argue the human and dog bones are similar in length and shape, so they would potentially share the most DNA. Whatever you said, as long as you can explain, that's a valid answer. To which organism, B, C, or D, is organism A most closely related? So organism A is most closely related to B because this is the highest percentage of similar DNA. A and B have 97% of their DNA in common. And organisms with similar DNA are more likely to be closely related. Which pair of organisms in the table is least closely related? Organisms A and D only have 50% similar DNA, and that's the least amount in this table. So organisms that are more distantly related will have less DNA in common. Which pair of organisms most likely shares a recent common ancestor? You could argue that A and B, as well as A and C, with the idea being more recently related organisms have DNA that is more similar. So if I go back to that, A and C have 85% of their DNA in common, which is a pretty high number, even though it's not as high as 97%. We could still use it for this question to say that either A and B or both A and B as well as A and C would most likely share a recent common ancestor. Suppose another organism called organism X is discovered. Suggest how scientists would use DNA comparison to classify organism X. They would look for the most recent common ancestor based on the amount of similar DNA. And the more similar the DNA, the more closely related the species. So now we're on to Model 4. This was probably the toughest one for you to analyze. Let's see how you did. How many different species are represented in the cytochrome C amino acid sequences? There are 8. What do the individual letters represent? They represent amino acids. What do the asterisks represent? That's a place where there's no information about that amino acid. So we can't use that in our evidence. Write down the number of differences between the amino acid sequence of cytochrome C in a human as compared to each of the following organisms in this table. So there are 21 differences for this amino acid sequence when you compare a human to a tuna fish. There are 10 differences when you compare a human to a whale. There's only one difference when you compare a human to a rhesus monkey. There's 13 differences comparing a human to a chicken, 10 differences between human and pig, 45 differences between human and yeast, and 27 differences between human and fly. So based on the differences in amino acid sequences, humans are most closely related to the rhesus monkey because there's only one difference in the amino acid sequence for this protein. And they are most distantly related to the yeast because there are 45 differences between amino acid sequence for that protein. Enter the names of the 7 organisms in Model 4 into the cladogram or tree diagram below to illustrate the evolutionary relationship between these organisms and humans as suggested by this cytochrome C data. This is what your cladogram should look like. It shows that yeast and human are the most distantly related. They are the furthest apart. And human and rhesus monkey are the most closely related. And then the other organisms are placed in order compared based on how many amino acids they have in common with the human for this particular protein. Okay, I am now going to debrief the practice assessment, just the questions that students had trouble with. If you look at this data, we are looking at a protein called protein A and the amino acid sequence for this protein. And we have data for humans, pigs, dogfish, chicken, Drosophila, which is a fruit fly, and yeast. How many amino acid differences are there between the human and the yeast? So you just start going across. There's one difference, glue versus lice. There's a second difference, so there's 2, and there's the third difference. So the answer is 3. Here is a picture like you had on today's document showing similarities in the forelimb of a human, a dog, a bird, and a whale. Which of the following statements are true about these images? There is commonality among the arrangement and number of bones in each forelimb of all of the organisms shown. That's the best answer from these choices. DNA is considered to be evidence for evolution. Consider 4 organisms. To which organism, B, C, or D, is organism A most closely related? It's most closely related to D because they have 78% of their DNA in common. And finally, biologists discovered 2 rabbit species that live on opposite sides of a large river. What could they do to test and see if these species came from a common ancestor? Select all that apply. They could compare DNA sequences. They could compare bone structures. They could compare amino acid sequences. These are all considered evidence for evolution as you learned today. This is an optional video which is in my slides. It's really well done and a great review of today's lesson, and I encourage you to watch it if you would like some additional information.